Already.
Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome to another session of Come Cloud with us. My name is Abdul Kazi, and I have my co-host Chris Gale. Hey Chris, how's it going?
Hey everybody, how are you? Good,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah. And this is a very special session because we have no other than Tim Warner here today. Obviously, Tim doesn't need an introduction. So we were kind of chatting before, and I've been watching Tim's videos since CBT Nuggets. A lot of folks might not even know what that is, but yeah. So Tim's really been around for some time now. So with that being said, we'll let Tim introduce himself.
Okay. Thanks, Abdul. Can I share my screen now, or were you going to present something first?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Share your screen.
All right. Let's present. Share screen. Entire screen. Okay. And do you want me to just go right ahead or just introduce myself?
You can go right ahead.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks, Abdul. Thanks, Chris, for having me. We're going to be learning about ChatGPT, GPT in general, and GitHub Copilot. This is going to be a great quick start for you. Hope you'll get a lot of benefit. My name's Tim Warner. I work full-time for Pluralsight as a staff author. I was formerly with Microsoft, and I've got a blog that I want to make sure to mention. It's got a couple posts up. It's brand new. It's Azure OpenAI.blog, and it focuses strictly on the Azure Open AI service, which, as you'll learn if you don't know already, is essentially if you're an enterprise and you're looking to take advantage of these extremely powerful generative AI models from OpenAI, you've really got two choices. You can consume the APIs directly from OpenAI, which it's okay, but they're not really built for enterprise usage. Or the only other option, frankly, is to use Azure OpenAI service. That's because Microsoft and OpenAI formed a very tight exclusive partnership. I learned it actually started that partnership in 2019. So what are we specifically going to learn about via PowerPoint, but mostly demo? I want to make sure to cover a little bit of foundational terminology. What do we mean by generative AI, for example? Is there a difference between GPT and ChatGPT? What's this thing with Codex and GitHub Copilot? I like to iron out that kind of stuff just to get that out of the way and make sure we're clear on what's going on so we don't get bogged down with terminology. We're going to spend our time on GPT in particular, but there's other OpenAI models that you might want to know about. And that's really it. I try to split this about half and half with ChatGPT and prompt engineering and all that good stuff and how that can fit in with your career as an IT professional. And then even going further, we can use GitHub Copilot to help us debug our code, refactor our code, create unit tests automatically, or very powerfully, GitHub Copilot can actually write code for us that we then can tweak and tune and refine. I'm finding that this generative AI stuff is becoming a dirty little secret. A lot of people in my life, both professionally and personally, will tell me in a half whisper, I'm a rock star at my work now, partially because I'm using Gen AI so much. This whole thing reminds me of the World Wide Web back in the mid-90s. I think we're really on the cusp of a huge paradigm shift across all industries, but speaking specifically in IT. For example, in the last year when I was at Microsoft, we were starting to leverage generative AI to automatically create reference documentation in Azure, you see. Think of businesses that need to localize their language, their text copy. I mean, there's ways you can do that in Azure with like cognitive services, but just the use cases for this, it's a real deal. It's not a flash in a pan. It's not a little hype and then it goes away. I really think this is a similar kind of ground shaking paradigm shift that we had. I remember in the late 80s, robotics and industry, and then the World Wide Web. Heck, I remember in the 70s, calculators weren't new, but I remember they were extremely controversial. How are the kids going to learn math if they're just punching into their calculators, If you want the copy of the slide deck, you're welcome to have it. If you point your browser to timw.info ChatGPT class, you'll find a copy of the slide deck as well as just some supplemental files. The README in that repo, it's an open repo at GitHub, is particularly useful. I think you'll find the links list on that README to be useful. So I don't want to get too bogged down here. In fact, what I'm actually going to do is just dump out into slide sorter view. And let's just see if I can drill into the most important slides before we do our first demo. Yeah, let's take a look at these ones right here. First of all, OpenAI, what exactly is it? It's an organization, I think they're based in California. It's important to know and recognize that they have both for-profit and not-for-profit arms. And you need, I would submit and recommend you keep that in mind, especially if you're going to use the ChatGPT public endpoint. But they're the masterminds behind these Gen AI models. ChatGPT, as we'll learn more about, is actually a specialized version of the generative pre-training transformer model, GPT. GPT is the parent model. We can look at ChatGPT as a specialized version of that model. And the difference between those two models are when you're addressing GPT, that's called what OpenAI calls their completion endpoint. You're just submitting plain text prompts and you're just getting a result back from the AI. ChatGPT has all of the conversational wrapping around it to where it feels more like you're interacting with another human being. But you'll see that GPT is called a large language model, or LLM, that understands and generates natural language text. GitHub Copilot is formally called an AI-powered pair programmer. Say that 3 times quickly. And its reason for being is to suggest code to us based on our context. And it can be frightening. Maybe we'll see some of this tonight about how it can almost, it feels like you read your thoughts sometimes, because within its context, it'll actually mimic your own coding conventions. Pretty powerful stuff there for sure. And lastly, Azure OpenAI is Microsoft's cloud-hosted collection of OpenAI models. And so, as I've mentioned, this is really where businesses, in my opinion, should focus their efforts. If they're looking, for example, to have their own instances of GPT and ChatGPT, and particularly they want to fine-tune those models on your own internal line of business data, and you need to do so in a secure, controlled, governed way. You've got all of Azure Resource Manager and the Microsoft Identity Platform supporting you in that context. So I'm a little biased, having been a Microsoft specialist for a couple dozen years, but it's very compelling. What OpenAI has done and what they continue to do in building these models, just a little side note here, a machine learning model is going to be ultimately a RESTful web service, a REST API, an application programming interface that's been trained in such a way based on enormous training and test data. It's a little bit controversial, maybe more than a little bit controversial, that for I don't know how many years, OpenAI has been spidering the public internet, vacuuming up everything it can to add to these data sets. And to this very moment, if you're using the ChatGPT UI application, you need to understand every word you put in there to your prompt is going to be part of training data. Now, that does not apply to Azure OpenAI service, or if you're consuming the GPT models directly from OpenAI. They say they don't use your data for training, but the public endpoint, and for the last X number of years, yes, good times, right? So we've got data on one side, and then we've got these way above my proverbial pay grade, mathematical statistical algorithms that look for patterns. Different algorithms look for different patterns in the source data. We combine the data and the algorithms together using massively parallel compute. And at the end of that process, you get your API that's going to give you, in the case of GPT, it's going to give you a prediction. The result is formally called a completion. And all of this is to say, the model becomes magical because we don't have to explicitly, imperatively program the model. We iteratively continue to feed it new data, tweak those algorithms, but ultimately at the end of the proverbial day, we're able to submit novel new input into the model, and based on its training, it should give you a good prediction or classification as a result. Making sense? If you're a developer, you should know, I'm just going to bring out all the elements on this slide. You should know that all the OpenAI models are just RESTful services. So anything you've done with REST APIs in the past applies here 100%, which hopefully is good news. It's pretty universal. You'll find that when you get below the surface and start digging into the sample applications and the help and the community around these OpenAI models, you'll find that there's a heavy emphasis towards Python. So I would recommend, and I will continue to, that putting Python in your tool belt would be a good idea here if you just want to be right on the front lines and have the fullest possible support for this stuff. Enough of the slides. Let's get into some demo here and kick the tires. And as I teach, understand that what I'm teaching will also be reflected in that slide deck. I just want to keep things lively. I know we're going to do lots and lots of questions at the tail end of this presentation as well, so please, I'm all ears and I will answer as candidly to the very perimeter of my knowledge, but not beyond that perimeter. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at what OpenAI calls their ChatGPT UI. It's chat.openai.com. My 13-year-old daughter, Zoe, she's in here all the time. I have friends who have nothing to do with IT and are getting a lot of education, edification, sometimes psychotherapy from this ChatGPT model. What's good about it? Well, it's free. There's a free tier. What's good about it, if you're willing to pay $20 USD a month, like I do, you can get ChatGPT Plus, which gives you the latest model. There's 3.5 Turbo and 4. Those are the two current line production GPT versions. GPT 3.5 is nowhere near as smart if you look at the statistics behind it as GPT 4. So what's the trade-off? Well, GPT 4 is slower, but it's also more expensive. So in terms of business, we have to think about which version or even subversion. I don't want to get too into the weeds with that, but there's different subvariants of GPT 3.5 that are optimized for different use cases. So, even though we're still so early days in all this stuff, there's still a fair amount to think about, And to that point, you'll note that I also have another website up. All of these sites are linked in the course, in the session files that I gave you the link to. Again, I'll give it to you orally now and show you the slide at the end. It's timw.info/chatgpt class. All right. This is platform.openai.com, and this is going to be your home if you have interest in consuming the GPT models more directly. Again, this ChatGPT is basically, it works great, so it's more than a proof of concept. But the biggest thing I always want you to understand above all else, I already mentioned it earlier, this is a way for OpenAI to get people in and using the model in a friendly way, but they're also vacuuming in anything you put in. So you never want to put any sensitive information into this endpoint. Please don't, because you can assume that everything you put in here is going into their training data and therefore will eventually be bubbled up to other users. Now, the reason why these models are called generative AI is because the result or the completion you get back from the AI is net new. It's not a copy and paste from Stack Overflow, for example. It's net new information. Like, as you can see, there's some sample prompts that we can try. How about we do show me a code snippet of a website sticky header in CSS and JavaScript. What I want you to see in the completion is some of the natural language, that chat aspect. This is why ChatGPT is called ChatGPT. It has the extra conversational wrapping around it. And I also want you to see that as a large language model, we can prompt both technical stuff that involves source code, as well as stuff that has nothing to do with text that's pure language. For example, I could say, what was that speech by Polonius in Hamlet where he said, "To thine own self be true"? So what I'm showing here is that as an LLM, as a large language model, GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4 are equally proficient at text and code generation. So that's one of those things I wanted to make sure to iron out with you, because I know I was confused at first, because I thought, hang on a second, I thought that there's ChatGPT, that's what we're doing here, conversational generative AI, and now I'm using GitHub Copilot, and that's a model called Codex. So, okay, Codex is source code, ChatGPT is text. But why is it that I'm able to get source code from ChatGPT and I can go in GitHub Copilot and it'll make a limerick for me? So the story with that is that Codex is gone. Forget it even existed. If you didn't know it existed, continue to believe it doesn't exist. It's deprecated, I think, as of March of this year. Nowadays, we've got kind of a kitchen sink. The GPT 3.5 Turbo and the 4 can do either. They're really universal. Now, there is another variant of GPT that does image generation, and that one is a fair bit different. If you're familiar with the Dali project, you can go to labs.openai.com, sign in with your account, and it'll take plain text and generate net new images. Remember, this is important, and this has big ramifications. I know in my own work as a technical trainer, I oftentimes need stock art. For all intents and purposes, I don't need to have a Shutterstock account anymore, because I just have Dali do it. Give me a conceptual, I'll do it right now. Give me an abstract painting that represents generative AI. Just literally whatever your inspiration is, you send that prompt in. And really, the whole prompt engineering bit is that the quality of your prompt into the AI is directly analogous to the results you get back from the AI. That's why I often say that the prompt engineering, it's become kind of a meme or a cliche in some ways. It's legit. There's no question about it. In fact, you'll see, as depending on whether you're using the ChatGPT public website or if you're consuming the API directly, we have in the ChatGPT public site what's called custom instructions. Now, notice if I open my user menu, I can go to custom instructions. This is what's called a system prompt. Your prompt into GPT, really, you can look at it as two parts. You don't have to do it in two parts, but I would recommend that you consider it. The system prompt is where you instruct the AI how it should behave. So in the ChatGPT UI, OpenAI wanted it to be as user-friendly as possible. So it's saying, what would you like ChatGPT to know? And then you could supply those instructions. I'm going to say, for example, you are an expert in all things Microsoft Azure. Now, check this out. How would you like ChatGPT to respond? I have existing Azure subject matter expertise, so please be very technical in your responses. You getting the picture here? So the more discreet we can be, that is to say, the more the AI knows what we're expecting of it, the better quality results you get. By contrast, if I wanted to learn more about Google Cloud and I'm more on the beginner side, I could say just the opposite. I'm new to this, so soft pedal your descriptions. You see what I'm saying? Or I could say, I could add to this, feel free to provide PowerShell and Azure CLI when appropriate. Anything like this helps. Now, to every tip, there's a trade-off, or to every advantage, there's a trade-off. We have to keep in mind what's called token count. If I go out to another browser tab, I'm going to go to platform.openai.com/tokenizer. This is a really nifty little utility because it shows you how you're going to wind up paying for using these models. Again, there's a difference. When you're using the ChatGPT UI, it's either free or you're paying $20 a month flat fee, end of story. You don't really have to worry about tokens so much. But when you're consuming the APIs as a business from either Microsoft or OpenAI, then tokenization becomes quite important because that's the consumption-based pricing that you're going to be on the hook for. So it's important to understand that. So I can put in some sample text here. And we can see the tokenizer breaks it down. It works out to be approximately 1 token per 4 characters. In this example, it's pretty much 1 token per word. And sometimes you might be surprised to see, like in this case, the period is actually considered as a token. As a developer or as a systems architect, this is important because you want to think about when you're implementing these models in your application, how are you going to take that prompt? Maybe you're pre-crafting the prompts. Maybe you're fetching the prompt from the user and then you're doing some massaging on it. You want to think about making your prompt as concise and accurate as possible. It's that counterbalance, really, between performance and cost and accuracy. So in this case, this particular string is going to be charged 11 tokens. And you'll find if you dig into the OpenAI pricing and the Azure OpenAI service pricing, in fact, I can quickly show you that. Eventually, I'm probably going to have like 20 tabs. Azure OpenAI service pricing. Let's just look it up here. It's similar. OpenAI does something similar, by the way. It's going to depend on what version of the model you're consuming. And then the context here, that's the token length, you see. So with GPT 3.5 Turbo, it looks like an Azure OpenAI service, you can use 4,000, 16,000 tokens. Why might you want to pay more for a longer token length? Well, if you're doing summarizations, you've got a use case where you've got a bunch of PDFs that are variable length, and some may be dozens of pages. Maybe you're taking scientific white papers or legal briefs, whatever it might be. It's trivial to have GPT give you outstanding summaries. Give me a 2-paragraph abstract of this 20-page white paper. Bada bing, there it is. Suddenly, I don't have to stay up late tonight doing this manually. This is why generative AI is a big deal. It's a real legitimate productivity boon. It's tremendous. I want to drill in just a little bit more on this token length business because there's some elements to it that might not be immediately obvious. And to do that, let me jump back to the slide deck for just a second because I've got a slide that talks more about this. Let me see here. Yeah, I think it's this one right here. This will do. It's important to understand that your token length actually incorporates not just the completion coming back from the model, which is what you'd expect. That's what you're after. You want a novel result. But unfortunately or fortunately, we're also charged for the prompt. So this is why, as I said, as a developer or systems architect, you want to think about those prompts that are ultimately being submitted to the model. Both Microsoft and OpenAI have moderation APIs that you can use. So you could actually take a free text prompt from the user, run it through the moderation API to make sure that it's not violating any, language, whatever, that kind of stuff before it actually goes to your model. But yeah, keeping in mind that your overall token length is going to be prompt plus completion. You might have noticed if you've used the ChatGPT UI that it remembers what it told you in the past. In other words, it maintains context. That's super useful, but that's also subject to the token length. I can't remember offhand if the ChatGPT UI has an 8K or 4K. It might be 8K, 8,000 tokens, which I don't remember how many single spaced lines of text that turns in. You can find that with a trivial search on Google or Bing. But it's important to note, let me finish this custom instruction. I think it looks good now. We're going to say that the AI is an Azure expert and it can give us technical language back. Fine. So now that we're back in our session here, so notice that I was chatting earlier with the AI about sunk cost bias of all things and doing some experimentation with plugins. I can revisit any of these past conversations and just pick up exactly where I left off. Isn't that great? But it's going to be subject to that token length. It actually, the length doesn't just pertain to the most recent couplet of prompt and completion. It's the whole conversation thread. So you can look at it as a moving window, a sliding window of 8,000 tokens, that the conversation will only have that much history available to it. So again, from an application development standpoint, depending upon how reliant on state and history you are, you might need to take that into consideration. If we go back to platform.openai.com, again, this is a wealth of knowledge on this site. When you start your journey, you sign in with your OpenAI account. And that can be a federated account. You can use your Google ID, your Apple ID, your Microsoft ID, or you could just do a straight up email account with OpenAI directly. There's basic enterprise stuff here. As you can see, if I go into my API page, it shows us that when I created my OpenAI account, you have to name your organization. And there's some basic group and member management here, which is nice for cost consolidation. So you can invite the rest of your team to join your organization, and then you can track usage and that kind of stuff, billing, of course. And each developer would have their own facility for generating API keys that you would attach to your requests into the API. The documentation over here covers each of the main models. Again, the parent model's GPT, and then the specialized versions, as you can see. We've got, let's see. Yeah, image generation, that's the Dali. GPT, that's the raw completion. And there's docs for the chat as well. I don't know if I'm just missing it with my head, but there we go. Well, that's chat plugins. There's a separate set of docs for the plugin capability. The docs, I mean, they're still pretty bare bones, but remember that we're early days with this stuff. Down lower to the ground, we've got the official API reference docs. Again, there's ChatGPT. The embeddings model, that deals with the subject of fine-tuning. And if you're here thinking of using these OpenAI models for business, you're doubtless thinking of, all right, it's great that I can use these GPT models in a conversational chat way with source code generation, and they're very smart on public data. But you've probably heard of the so-called September 2021 problem. You familiar with that? That OpenAI did the bulk of their model training up to that September 2021 window. And that means you're going to run into a dead end. For example, if I try to ask ChatGPT now, let me open up a new chat, and let me try to ask about it something that we know is going on post September 2021. Now, you can override that a little bit by using plugins. These third-party plugins provide a way to give your GPT, or in this case, plugins at this point only work with the Chat GPT, and even more specifically, as of, where are we? August of 2023, it only works with this public app, unfortunately. It's not available. Plugins aren't surfaced in the API or at Azure OpenAI service yet. So we're stuck. And like I say, if we ask about something really current, like which Azure features, or I'll say which Azure services were released in March 2023, we'll probably get some boilerplate back saying, yeah, there we go, as of my knowledge cutoff. So that can be very frustrating for us IT pros, because how much has changed in the IT, particularly the cloud computing landscape, since September of 2021. It's really annoying. Now, OpenAI has a couple of their own plugins. Let me see. Why am I not seeing them in this list here? Let me again go to a new chat. There we go. Yeah. They have, I think, 3 of their own plugins. There's a code interpreter that's in beta or pre-release, and that actually can run Python. You can upload a Python script and have it run, or you can just have the model generate code for you live in the chat and have it actually run. There's a sandboxed Python interpreter running somewhere in the Azure cloud, and you can invoke that using it. It's a pretty cool plugin. But the main one that I miss so much is the one called Web Search. It integrated with the Bing search engine. And it was great, of course, because it allowed us to ask ChatGPT questions more recent than September 2021. And OpenAI needed to pull it because some bugs and also some unexpected results that were coming back. So I have my fingers and toes crossed that it'll come back sooner rather than later. I can't imagine it wouldn't. Microsoft has given OpenAI over $10 billion, and you know who owns Bing. So there's a little bit of a vested interest going on in there. As far as the third-party plugins, you'll find that there are some of those that allow web search. So I would invite you to take a look at those third-party plugins. The ones that you see in the ChatGPT UI and the plugin store, these are are developers and companies who have submitted their plugin for validation. And you can't even get a developer account nowadays. You can get on a waiting list, but I've been on the waiting list for several weeks with no end in sight. Again, early days stuff is what we're talking about. And frankly, you need a developer account in order to sideload plugins that you develop yourself at this point, if it's not in the store. So that's a bit of a dead end subject for us right now. Hope this is making some semblance of sense. More to the point with IT stuff. If you're going to consume the APIs directly, fine and good. You also can test your completions against the APIs by going, for instance, in platform OpenAIcom to the playground. So this playground interface allows us to do our system prompt and our user prompt. I guess I didn't explain the user prompt. Whoops. As I mentioned earlier, the system prompt is where you're telling the AI how to behave and how it should respond to you. And then the user prompt is what you're actually asking it to do. So if we go back to ChatGPT, for instance, you'll remember that I set up my system prompt saying that you're an Azure expert and we should have code. So it now should be pretty easy for us to say, let's say that we were tasked with, trying to think of something that I know is friendly to before September 2021. Please give me an Azure CLI script that creates a cognitive services multi-account. And we could go on from here if we wanted to. If you were going to do this using API, you would just put your system prompt first, and then you would add your user prompt, as you can see here. So again, because we know that ChatGPT can do code generation just as easily as it can do text, we can move on from here. What are some other tips and tricks for being really good with our prompts? Well, you see in the tech news nowadays, this notion of zero-shot conversations with GPT or multi-shot. All that really deals with is shortening the gap between the prompt and the result that you want to see. Oftentimes I find in my work, because I'm using GPT every day, both in my day job and personally, that it turns into a conversation. It turns into an iteration. For example, I might copy this code out of this code window, run it, and find that it's not correct. That's an important sidelight that I should call out. It's mentioned here in the fine print that ChatGPT may produce inaccurate information about people, places, and facts. It's true. GPT wants to give you something back in a completion, and it'll happily give you incorrect info at times. My Pluralsight colleague and friend Simon Allardyce did an actual pretty formal study where he asked GPT to look up all these scientific citations and stuff, and GPT was happy to come back with this bibliography, and Simon tracked down each of those references. Some were legit, I think most were, but some were not only incorrect, they were complete fabrications. Again, early days. I know I'm sounding like a broken record. I'm optimistic this hallucination problem will gradually get less and less over time, but it underscores the principle of trust but verify. I found that if I ran this code and it bombed out, what I'll often do is literally copy the error text and just say, fix this error. You know what I'm saying? And I've had pretty good results, actually, working collaboratively with ChatGPT that way. Now, if you're going to use the ChatGPT UI, let me repeat. If you're working with your internal line of business data, you want to be double, triple sure to sanitize said data so you're never putting any sensitive stuff in there. That's one of the benefits, like I said, of consuming the API directly. So this is the playground from OpenAI.com. They have a bunch of sample applications. The playground itself has a bunch of example queries that you can send in. Let's see if we can quickly find one that's relevant to cloud professionals. This one's on coding, improving code efficiency. So it's got the system prompt and then the user prompt. We're submitting some code to it and asking it for help. So again, we don't need GitHub Copilot for this. You might be completely happy in your completions coming back from GPT or ChatGPT. One benefit, again, about using the API is the control it gives you. Notice how the playground allows you to choose specific models and submodels, and also allows you to tweak and tune properties. There's 3 properties that are particularly important with GPT. You can't get those controls using the UI, but you can at the API level. And that would be temperature, maximum length, and stop sequences. Temperature is a measure of randomness, really. As it says here, lowering results is less random. So the higher you make the temperature, the more creative the AI will be. So it's a question of how deterministic do you want your results to be from the AI? And so you've got this slider control that allows you to jog that. And the higher the temperature, the less predictable, the more creative, and perhaps the more verbose those results are coming back. That verbosity is an important point here. Maximum length determines the maximum number of tokens to generate between the prompt and completion. Remember that your token count is that couplet. And so this is saying, I only want to burn. So this is a good way to enforce that your token count will not exceed a certain length. So it's good to have that control. And you also can put in a stop sequence, a string that when it appears will stop the generation. So again, those are ways to cut down on that verbosity, because remember, ultimately you're paying for that verbosity. All right. How does this impact, or how does this relate, say, to Azure? I can incorporate a little bit on this as well. Assuming that you've got an Azure subscription, how would you get started using these models in a private context? Well, what we'd look for in the portal is the Azure Open AI service. And the last time I checked, you have to opt in. Because Microsoft is getting flooded with so much demand, you have to fill in a Microsoft form to request that they load this service provider into your subscription. That shouldn't take long, fingers crossed. It didn't take me more than a day, I think. And also, even once you've been green-lighted to start your own Azure Open AI service, the off-the-shelf instance, which you see I created one here, will have only the GPT 3.5 variants. You have to, again, opt in to request access to GPT-4. And I've been on that waiting list for a while. I don't know if and when they'll approve me. I hope they do. But early days, early days. If you're wondering where those wait lists are, I would just look at the Microsoft Learn docs for Azure Open AI service. And it's right there at the top of the what is Azure Open AI service. There'll be links to get on the wait list there for that. When you create a new Azure Open AI service, I just want to quickly highlight a couple of things that I think are big game changers. Let me see. Well, it looks like I'm going to have to fill in a little of this. The name for your service does have to be globally unique, even though it doesn't say so. Pricing tier as of now is just 1. Right here. This is a really big deal, even though it might not appear it. You've probably seen these controls on all of the Azure data products, the hosted databases, Azure storage, etc. By default, the service is going to be dangling out on the internet, and you're going to ingress on a public Microsoft-owned IP. That's how it normally works, because Azure is a public cloud, a public multi-tenant cloud. But we also can take advantage of Azure Private Link, where we can completely disable ingress from the internet and communicate with your Azure Open AI service privately in the context of a virtual network. Isn't that amazing? That is a big deal. You can't do that with OpenAI, but you can with Azure Open AI service. This gives businesses that privacy and that confidence that you can train up your own instances of these OpenAI models, these GPT models, and communicate with them using private, non-internet routable IP addresses. Now, the assumption there is that you have a way to get into the virtual network. So we're talking about a site-to-site VPN, point-to-site VPN, express route circuit, or maybe coming in through a jump host into the virtual network environment. All right? So that's cool. Let me go back, because I've already got an instance created that we can look at. Once you're in an Azure Open AI service instance, we've got a lot of the traditional Azure Resource Manager governance controls that we know and hopefully love, like role-based access control, taxonomic tagging, all the integration with log analytics and Azure Monitor monitoring. Oh, this is one right here, cost analysis. I did not see at last check any facility over at the OpenAI side on cost control. You just have to be careful of your usage. Over here, we've got native ability to do budgeting and alerting, just like we do across all of Azure Resource Manager. It's a big deal. And likewise, we have the robustness of the Azure alerting platform to rely on as well. Notice that we've got an endpoint URI and we've got our API keys. You want to keep very careful track of those for obvious reasons. But again, whereas at the OpenAI side, it's not built for speed. It's not built for enterprise access. Each developer is responsible for maintaining their own keys, and there's not a facility to rotate them. It's really bare bones. But on the Azure side, we could store these keys in Azure Key Vault, and we could even do a little automation to auto regenerate and rotate the keys. You see, all that kind of stuff. Microsoft created a separate web portal for Azure OpenAI. So if I click Manage Deployments, it's going to click us out to oai.azure.com, where each user is going to have their own view in what's called the Azure AI Studio. And as you can see, there's playgrounds where you can look at your models that you've deployed through the lens of chat, just straight up completions, or Dali, image generation. Hey, that's a big deal. Why? Because if we go over to data files, we can start training our models on our own images, on our own data, on our own source code. Wow, that's the fine tuning. And that gets into the weeds with what's called embeddings. You've probably heard that term bandied around a little bit. What does embeddings mean? Embeddings is where you can send the API your source data, and it will create, those word clouds that were popular with blogs in the when was that? Early 2000s, where more frequent words were bigger, closer together. That's how I think of embeddings in my mind. It's a way for the API to make a map of your source data and find correlations between it and among it and so on. So the embeddings is going to be critical when you're fine-tuning these models, because you're going to want to search. You're going to want to do semantic free text search against your data. And so that embedding graph, for lack of a better term, is going to be critical for the AI to successfully and in a time-efficient manner give you those search results. Now, unfortunately, you notice here that upload a new data set, not working. That's because Microsoft has put a gate down as of, again, I keep forgetting the day and date. I'm forgetting everything but my own name. That's another story for another time. August 24th of 2023, it's gated. I don't even know if there's a wait list at this point. According to the docs, when I looked it up the other day, current customers who got in under the fence are able to do fine-tuning. The rest of us have to twiddle our thumbs and look at the docs and hope. That's where we're at with fine-tuning in the Azure OpenAI service. I did read in the tech news that over at platform.openai.com, they've rapidly, in fact, here it is right here, fine-tuning for GPT 3.5 Turbo is now available. So you can also fine-tune in the OpenAI ecosystem as well. And again, I want to repeat, I know I'm repeating certain things many times, but it's super important, I think, that when you're consuming the APIs from OpenAI or from Microsoft, both companies state explicitly that they're not taking your prompts and putting them into training. No, the only time that is relevant is when we're using the ChatGPT UI. Last thing I want to do over at Azure AI Studio, I'll go to deployments. You can see I've created a new deployment of GPT 3.5 Turbo. If I take a look here just to verify, notice that it's giving me some GPT 3.5s, but I'm waiting to be allowed to use GPT 4. Now, you should know that GPT 4 is significantly more expensive than GPT 3.5. So I would submit that you want to put some research into your use case. What is it exactly that you want to do with GPT? And you may be able to use a smaller variant that's less expensive, potentially a lot less expensive. That'll suit your use case just fine. You don't necessarily have to supersize it and go for the biggest, most expensive GPT-4 necessarily. If I click my instance here, it's important to remind myself that this is my own private instance of the GPT model with all its worldwide of knowledge. And there's a playground interface here in Azure AI Studio, just like there is over at OpenAI. And we can adjust. In this case, there's some controls that we didn't have in OpenAI. We can include the session history. Pass message include X number of exchanges. If we go to parameters, we've got the temperature control, we've got the maximum response length. So very similar. And that's by definition very similar. All right? I know that time's a ticking here, and I want to make sure that we do GitHub Copilot as well. GitHub Copilot is, at least as of now, a smaller product. That's why I'm not spending as much time on it, but hopefully you won't be mad at me. What I want to do is go to GitHub Copilot's landing page at GitHub. And I also want to bring up GitHub Copilot X, because that's just as important for you to know about right out of the gate. First of all, top line, what do you need to know about GitHub Copilot? It's specifically for code generation, but you can have it generate a sonnet for you. It'll do text as well. But the idea is, as you're coding, regardless of your language, if you're an Azure person and you're using Azure PowerShell or the Azure CLI, cool. The language that GPT is smartest on is, wait for it, Python. But it really doesn't matter. If JavaScript, C#, whatever, HTML, CSS, you name it, even shell scripting, it'll do it. Simple as that. This is because it was trained, at the least, OpenAI put it across all of the public GitHub repos. So again, without our permission, all of your open source repos are in fact in GPT, like it or not. But what I want you to know about that is if we sign in to GitHub, hopefully I'm already signed in, github.com, figures. All right, let me quickly do my second factor here because I want to show you this. It's an important control in your account. So let me grab my second factor auth code here. Let's see, 649860. Okay, yeah, so if we go into your user settings, and actually, if you're wondering how to sign up for Copilot, you'll see lots of advertisements at GitHub. Right in your user menu, there's Try Copilot. And when you sign up for Copilot, it is a paid service. I think it's $10 USD a month, or if you want to prepay, you get a discount, $100 a year. But once you've signed up, the free trial, I think, is 30 days. And normally they let you extend the trial. They let me extend it for like another 60 days before I wound up paying. In your user settings, if you go down under Code Planning and Automation Copilot, this is where you can opt out and say to allow GitHub to use your code for product improvements or not. So there's some limited basic controls of your data, but at least we do have a choice now, whereas for the past X number of years we didn't. Now, I use Visual Studio Code, but GitHub Copilot also integrates with the full Visual Studio. It integrates with the JetBrains IDEs. Is Eclipse in there? Is JetBrains, do they own Eclipse? I don't remember. But if you use a JetBrains IDE, there is a GitHub Copilot extension for that. And there's also a native integration for NeoVim if you're a VI Vim person. But I'm a VS Code person. So you get into code, it doesn't have to be the insider's build. And you'll go into the extensions gallery and we'll simply look up GitHub Copilot. There it is. Install the extension, reload, sign in to GitHub. And that's all you have to do. As long as you've got Copilot in your user account as an add-on, it'll light up and get in Visual Studio Code or your IDE once you've signed into GitHub with that same credential. And you'll see, although it's probably small on my screen share, in the lower right corner of VS Code, there's a little Copilot icon. And that's where you can deactivate it, reactivate it. Because I found in daily practice, sometimes I'd prefer to use the language extension for autocomplete for IntelliSense. And sometimes IntelliSense can fight with GitHub Copilot, so I might turn it off for a while. You also might have a security situation where you want to make sure that you're not communicating with the Copilot service. Now, according to the GitHub Copilot FAQs, they don't take your data and use it, period. And I showed you the control in your GitHub user properties where you can opt out of your public repos being used in the training data as well. I also I've read all of the GitHub Copilot docs. They say that even when over the past X years when they were training GPT, that they never would attempt to access private GitHub repos. It was just public ones. So just take all that for what little or lot it's worth. Another thing I'd like you to look at when you're in VS Code is look in the extensions marketplace for GitHub Copilot Chat. I've been getting a lot of great use on this guy right here. This is something you have to opt into extra. You don't have to pay extra for it, and it looks like it's updated, so I need to reload my editor to take advantage of it. When you install the GitHub Copilot Chat extension, you'll find on the left-hand navigation bar, or what's called the activity bar, you'll see a new element here, right here for chat. And what this does is it gives you the ChatGPT interface directly within VS Code. This is a game changer in my opinion, because normally and historically, the two ways that we invoke suggestions from GitHub Copilot are either A, as you type. For example, I could start a function declaration in my PS1 file, and based on the names of your objects, you'll get recommendations that come back in line. In fact, I'll show you. Let's say we want a function to calculate system uptime. Now, I don't think calculate is an approved verb in PowerShell, but whatever. And actually, is that even the right syntax? It's been a while. Oh, brother. How embarrassing. I think it's curly braces. But the bottom line is you'll find as you're typing, if there is a recommendation that comes back from GPT, it'll show up. And I'm done at a loss here as far as why I'm not seeing something. Let me see if I can try something else. Because another way to do it is to do a comment, like a line comment or a multi-line comment, and then get recommendations that way. So I might say PowerShell function that gives system uptime. Press enter, hands off the keyboard. Oh, yeah, here we go. Embarrassment alert. See how it's deactivated? You probably saw that, right? And you're like, hello, Tim, you need to enable the service first. Yeah. The problem is between my keyboard and chair as usual. God, I wish time didn't go by so quickly because I am reserving time for your questions. And if it's okay with you guys, Abdul and Chris, maybe I can can it at 7 and then do questions. How long do you normally go?
Yeah, it'd be about right. I mean, it tends to be, put it this way, there's a lot that you have packed into the session, so
Yeah,
we're at your whim. But Tim, I just wanted to share one thing with you. As you're going through all these extensions, one of the things that I did trip over was there's Copilot voice. And I don't know if you were toying with that, but I turned that on, and as you were talking, I saw it deactivate, and then it reactivated, and it deactivated. So,
whoa.
But for folks who may have, a little bit of trouble typing or mousing or whatever else, you could actually use voice to use it too. So something I want to toy with.
Is that a first-party extension or third-party? Who made it?
It looks like it's a first party. So,
ooh, that's good. I'm going to jump.
Yeah, I was just kind of following along with you, but yeah, it's definitely published by GitHub. So GitHub Copilot Voice is what they call it.
Thanks for that. Copilot Voice. Yeah, I will try that tonight. Again, the development in this space is so fast. Yeah. Anyway, now that I've enabled Copilot, you can see that after I pressed enter after my line comment, I took my hands off the keyboard and we've got a recommendation. So you can get used to, as you're actually coding, if you forget or don't know how to do something, try just describing it in a line comment and pressing enter and seeing what happens. And it will reference variables and objects from your context. And when I say context, I want you to understand that as of now, Copilot's context is your open tabs. So eventually I would imagine that over here in Explorer, Copilot will be able to reach in your workspace. I'm not sure about the privacy implications of that. But right now, if you want Copilot to take advantage of functions or classes and stuff that you've got going on in your project, make sure that they're open as editors, because Copilot can reach across those. So I want you to see that we have this little toolbar here, and you can use this ellipsis to always show the toolbar. I like it myself, but the keyboard shortcuts are Tab to accept the whole thing, Control right arrow to accept a word at a time. If there's more than one suggestion, you can cycle them either using the little toolbar, and I'm a little surprised it's only showing one because a moment ago it had two. I'm going to say PowerShell function that gives system uptime. I'm not sure how else I want to say that, but anyway, it's to go to the next one, I believe it's Control closed square bracket, and to go to the previous suggestion, it's Control open. You can hover over, oh, there it is, Alt, I'm sorry. So next is Alt closed square brackets. Previous is Alt open square brackets. I'm going to hit Tab, and away you go. So you theoretically can just keep typing Tab. If you don't want to accept it, you can just hit Escape. So let me Control Z and bring back the suggestion again. If you see a suggestion, quickly scan it, and don't want it, hit Escape, and then just keep on typing. All right? So those are historically have been the two ways to work. Just as you're typing, so that example I gave before, calculate, if I can spell, calculate system uptime. And then I'll open that block, press enter. Yeah, there we go. And this one, again, it's just giving me one back. Now, it's important to understand this is net new. Now, I have seen on Twitter, or in Reddit also, people claiming that they've seen references to their code actually show up. I mean, it's possible. It's not supposed to happen, though, but early days is early days. Coming back to the chat, this can be really, really helpful for things like, I've got this number guessing Python script. I'm going to select it to make sure that the AI knows of what I'm talking about. And you can either in Copilot chat just do / and use these useful keywords, or you can just ask it outright. Let's say a colleague shared a script with you, and you don't have the time right now because we're all busy. Just explain this to me really quickly. We can do / explain as a shortcut way to ask GitHub Copilot, what's this all about? And in this case, it's giving me instantly a breakdown of exactly what this code does from soup to nuts. By contrast, if there's just a part of the script or the code element, the code file, we could just do a selection. That's something else. I've seen earlier today a way to get to some of those Copilot chat shortcuts from the editor. I'm not triggering it correctly, but what I'll do normally is I'll just select the block and try / explain. Some of the other / commands are fix, that's nice. Search, simplify, tests. I mean, with test-driven development, like in PowerShell doing pester tests, you can just have it create those pester tests for you. Amazing productivity possibilities there. Let me try simplify. I don't know how much it can simplify just that little if block. A little bit, I guess it did. Or we could, as I said, just do a / explain. Now, I've had GitHub Copilot generate entire applications. It'll scaffold out entire apps for you as well. And again, all the principles that we looked at with prompt engineering apply here as well. Can you make me a JavaScript app that's a to-do manager. Have it use, what's that tiny little database called? SQLite as a back end. And then you can literally, right from in here, that's why the chat, I think, is so powerful. Because instead of horsing around with line comments and having dynamic suggestions come up, you're carrying on a conversation with an expert programmer. So this is a really big deal, and that's how I'd like to close. Let me go back to the browser one more time. That chat is part of what's called GitHub Copilot X. And what's cool about this, at least as of now, is that it doesn't cost more money. You just need a GitHub Copilot account. And gradually, we're going to see some huge evolutions in this space. We're already able to use the chat, as you can see. I don't remember how I onboarded, so I'll leave it to your homework to do. Do a Google search for onboard to Copilot chat, but that's that. But there's more. Let me quickly explain. Oh my gosh, this GitHub, this Copilot for PRs, if you and your team are using GitHub, this is amazing because instead of you having to think about, now what was my change set again? You know, the old saw about writing a meaningful PR, a pull request summary. It can, if you allow it to, give you a summary with targeted, with code links, what's in that change set. I mean, come on, is that not amazing? There's also, and I'm super excited about this, Copilot for CLI, where this is going to run, I think, client side, so in your terminal. And it has, I think, 3 different contexts to it. One would be Git. What's that Git command to show me just this? You know, Git is pretty arcane in some of its syntax. There's a GitHub CLI query. What's the GitHub CLI to create a pull request? So you potentially can start springboarding automations that you previously didn't have time for, to where you're being able to automate things like PRs that you frankly didn't have the time or willingness to dive into previously. And what I also like about this CLI, this GitHub Copilot for CLI, is that it works with shell commands. So with Linux in particular, pretty arcane syntax there. I don't know. I think it's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that there's more to that. There's another site I promise I'll end with, called GitHub Next. And that's just the next generation of GitHub across the board, including both Copilot and non-Copilot. So enough. I want to answer your question. So let me get back to the slideshow, bring up my summary slide. As you can tell, I'm passionate about this subject. Lost my mouse pointer. There we go. All right. Thank you. Chris, Abdul, questions? How can I be of service?
Yeah. So, Tim, this has been awesome. Thank you. We did have one question about a half an hour ago. So when you were deep into some of the tokens and stuff, one person asked, when you say tokens, do you mean character limit of the conversation? Could you clarify that for us?
That's a way to look at it. But remember that a token turns out to be approximately 4 characters. That platform.openai.com/tokenizer will give you an opportunity to play with different inputs, and you can see how those inputs are converted into tokens. Unfortunately, it's not entirely deterministic to where you could say a straight up character count. A more useful analogy would be a word count. Again, that's kind of loose.
Gotcha. Thank you. Then there was another, so there was a little bit of a feedback thing, which is something we could talk about. This person also mentioned that Microsoft has Power Virtual Agents, which introduced AI capabilities as well in the chatbot. So, brief summary, your experience there, Tim.
Yeah, the truth of the matter is Microsoft scored a huge win by doing this partnership with OpenAI. And they are injecting these GPT models into probably most, if not all, of their products and services, including, for example, the Power Platform family. I mean, at first blush, you might think, hang on a second, why do we care about ChatGPT? We can create chatbots using Power Virtual Agents or the underlying Azure bot framework. But sure enough, nowadays you can make your Power Virtual Agents bots infinitely smarter, or nearly, infinitely smarter, by attaching them to GPT. I haven't gotten hands-on with it yet.
Yeah.
In the Power Platform, one example I have used to good effect is in Power BI. You can, in your Power BI dashboards, you can just hit a Insights button, and it will leverage GPT to analyze the data in your dashboard and maybe give you insights that you didn't see previously. So that's a potentially very useful application of GPT in a Microsoft software as a service app.
Awesome. And then one last one. It's again, this person is just rocking it tonight. So I got a lot of feedback, a lot of questions. But
Good.
Would you recommend using PVA or Azure OpenAI service if I wanted to keep SharePoint communication site / internet as my data source? So I'm thinking maybe that's more of a knowledge base or something. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, just off the top of my head, I'd have to know more plumbing details to give a more granular response. But my top line response is that there already is so much plumbing baked into the Power Platform tools and SharePoint OneDrive. I would probably want to stay there. And then if I wanted to extend into the GPT model, do it using Power Virtual Agents as your springboard. Because let's face it, the Power Platform is far more mature than Azure OpenAI services.
Sure. Awesome. I don't see any other questions. Abdul, did you have anything I might have missed? A lot of great feedback from folks.
And I know we're kind of tight on time, so we want to be respectful of Tim's time. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, as I have on the summary screen, we are on the front end of this technology. So I would encourage all of you to not let this intimidate you. I know that thinking back to the late 80s, people were concerned about robots putting them out of a job, and it did put people out of a job. And from what I understand, this Gen AI stuff is affecting service desks in particular. That's a reality. But I would encourage you to future-proof your career by getting smart with this technology sooner rather than later, because we're on the front end of it. Great time to get smart on it. And also dig more into this notion of prompt engineering, because that's how you program the model. It's all about crafting the most accurate and concise prompts you can. There's a link to the session materials again, timw.info ChatGPT class. You can look me up on LinkedIn. I'm more than willing to contact with you offline at any time. timw.info is my personal website, and my new blog is azureopenai.blog. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Great job, Tim. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining. Folks, thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully you learned something from this. I know I did. A lot of great resources out here. Check out Tim's site, smash our subscribe button, and Tim, we'd love to have you back sometime too. So,
of course,
we always say
anytime.
that. We're going through a ton of folks, but we'd love to, learn with you, learn from you, and help the community out as we go. So,
anytime. Thanks again.
Awesome. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.